is.
Welcome back, everyone, to Skin in the Game, here for the third day of Mother/Other Festival for the Wheeler Centre, where an extraordinary range of international and Australian writers are gathering together to engage with the birthing body, maternal figures, the perinatal health system, and gendered roles in parenting. For those of you just joining us here today, in person or online, I would like to once again acknowledge that this event is taking place on the unceded land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. On behalf of us all, I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. I also recognise any First Nations people here today with us, with gratitude and with respect. A little reminder, I just want to welcome us all to this space, and that was perfectly on cue, that cry.
Well done, well done.
Welcome you as we mean to go on. This is a space that is for people, including children. So you do whatever you need to do to feel comfortable in this space, wherever you and your little people find yourselves. It is right for us. There is an extra room at the back if you feel like you need more space to feed, to rest, to relax. There's a kettle, a microwave, some additional chairs, and our friendly ushers will help you find your way. There is also a little play space and area, and that's welcome for everyone, even if you are not here with a small person. I sometimes do not like to stare at a room in this really didactic way. Feel free to chill out and do some colouring. I want to also recognise and thank again Claire Tonti, who has provided this musical intro and outro backdrop for this whole weekend from her album Matrescence, which is available for sale from our very friendly neighbourhood books who are up in the back corner. There's also a little community wall up here, a series of small notes that participants, panellists and others have been placing up against the wall about the kind of parenting/mothering advice that they wish they had received. So if you feel like you want to add a voice to that, then please feel welcomed to that little community wall of messages at the back there. More generally, there are also bathrooms available at the rear of the room, and we're going to speak today for about 40 or so minutes, and generously our three panellists have kindly agreed to welcome and field questions, so feel free to spend the next 30 or so minutes carefully crafting your question, or not carefully crafting it at all, just write it on your phone if you feel like it. But I will at a point throw to the Wheeler Centre ushers to help us answer those questions. I also want to recognise right out of the gate that this conversation may raise issues. In fact, all of the conversations across this weekend can and may raise issues for various people. And certainly, as much as the fearlessness of these conversations was a prominent part of the marketing paraphernalia for this event, I have felt genuine fear in preparing for this conversation, knowing how close so many of the topics are to my own experience and to my own really deeply unresolved trauma around lots of things. So I want to have that conversation as safely as I can as a person, but as safely as I can as a collective, and to do that with respect and care for each other, knowing that everyone arrives wherever they are today. So let's talk to a few of our fellow travellers, gently and with compassion, and while I unstick my notes from the clipboard, because we want to talk about bodies that change. And change is an incredibly difficult concept for so many in our culture, and pregnant bodies change in dramatic, graphic, and often deeply public ways. And as public as that change is, the true physical cost of pregnancy and birth is so much less discussed, so much less acceptable and interesting and desirable. And because I'm all about today evoking the one and only Cardi B, what I want to do today is to question why Pregnant WAP has no anthem yet. We want to talk today about sex, about desire and emotions, about why society holds such rigid expectations of pregnant people and parents to look a certain way and certainly to behave a certain way. How being a mother seems to elicit the societal knee-jerk Madonna whore complex with so little regard for the pregnant person as a whole, complex, social, sexual and non-sexual being. With us today is April Hélène-Horton, also known as the Bodzilla, who advocates for body acceptance and fat positivity. She is joined on the very far edge by Lefa Singleton Norton, who is a writer and a producer who recently wrote about her experience parenting with a disability in the book We've Got This, Stories by Disabled Parents. And finally, we have Frankie Van Can, writer, performance artist, sex worker and parent. I'd also like to apologise and recognise that, not apologise, but recognise that Vanessa Meridian was also going to be appearing in this event, but is right now caring for a newborn infant, literally the best reason for welching on a panel ever. So please welcome all three of our guests with a warm round of applause. April, I want to start with you. You are all about fat joy. A passionate advocate for intersectional experience. You're a noted MC, keynote speaker. You can have my job, the notes are right here. But you give people the confidence to take up the space that they deserve. In 2021, you led the way as Australia's first truly plus-size model to appear in a bikini on a billboard, and you were a part of a 3-part national TV series, and you raised a kid. You champion racial equity, LGBT inclusion, sex positivity, and fat liberation. I know too that you also use the word fat with its positive and deeply political connotations. But pregnancy and birthing, they're more than just an experience of getting fat. In the much less positive and much less political use of that word, it's an experience of being surveyed, of being surveilled, being judged, lauded, sometimes congratulated, on getting fat, but only in the right way. And later on, getting as unfat as possible, as quickly as possible. So fat, pregnant people, for me, are a critical site on the war against fatness. They're often viewed as irresponsible. They're threatening the health of their pregnancy and the far-off future of their child. I had gestational diabetes as a geriatric mother, and I certainly felt the full weight of the way that contemporary biomedical notions of fatness are imbued with a long-standing script around who is a good mother and what that good mother does, and that women's bodies in particular are deviant and kind of unwieldy relative to the standards that are placed upon them. I want to know, given that huge weight of experience, how you as a political person navigated that medical terrain and what sources of joy you found as a fat pregnant person or otherwise.
Thank you for what an intro. I think, truthfully, at the time that I was pregnant, I was still very much bogged down in body standards that I could never meet. I don't know why I thought I was ever going to. And my body had changed quite a lot over the kind of 2 years preceding my pregnancy. And so, as someone who now quite proudly uses the F word, all of them in fact, and being joyful in my fatness, I downplayed being fat as much as possible. I leaned away from that word about saying it. I accepted the praise from my medical caregivers who said, oh, you're doing quite well, like you're not, you haven't gained too much weight, well done, you haven't gained weight. And I don't think I've ever been praised as much about my physical appearance as I was in my late pregnancy, where I had such a cute bum, but look, your face is so thin, your face looks so... My face looks gaunt. I look scary like Bella in Twilight. Like, it wasn't good. And I think afterwards, the same thing, I went to have my licence photo taken when my child was 3 weeks old. And everyone was like, oh my God, are you wearing jeans? I was like, yeah, well, that's just what there was. Because honestly, I can't see 4 feet in front of me. So I just was like, this will do. They're only taking a picture of this part, so it's fine. And I think that I truly didn't understand the importance of embracing the me that was and the person I had been before I became pregnant. Like, I think I celebrate her more now than I ever did, because in my pregnancy and then in motherhood, I've realised what importance, I should or should not have placed on performing being a good fatty for doctors. Doctors who would stand up, turn around. Okay, no, I think that you have, diagnosing me with random things during my pregnancy. So when you've had the baby, we'll check about that. And talking to me about my body as if to say, it's still a bit of an issue, but we've got to just really focus on the one at the front for now, and we'll figure out whether or not you have other, issues afterwards. And I think, what I've realised since then is being someone who delves into the political aspects of having a body that rejects those standards, and that I will actively celebrate the bodies of other people who look like me and not like me, is that we perform our existence on a daily basis in all the different ways that we've been cued, both, covertly and overtly. And I think that engaging...
Sometimes coercively.
Almost always coercively, in some people's cases. And I think that the idea that we would perform something so deeply personal and something that we were only experiencing for the first time. Every time you have something new happen to you during pregnancy, you're having that for the first time, and then having to perform that as someone who's embraced, oh, I'm so joyful to be going through what could be a painful, terrifying, anxiety-inducing, depressing situation, but I have to be like, but I'm so grateful. And I think that it's really difficult to also to be grateful and be allowed to be grateful when you also simultaneously have to apologise for how you look. It's quite the balance. It can be kind of exhausting, but it brings me so much joy now to look back and go, I was kind of mean to the person that I used to be, but I'm still her and I'm being nice now. So I think I can only do the most to make up for all those times when I maybe treated myself a bit terribly, and just really hope to embrace other people and hold other people's space to be allowed to be ourselves, but especially during a vulnerable time like motherhood.
I just want to follow up on that and say, because that's a bit of an inflection, I suppose, on your story that I wasn't really aware of, that this, that transition in your relationship to yourself happened after having children, a child. And I wondered too what advice you pose to other people who may or may not identify as fat. Do you know what I mean? How you identify and how others identify you is often very different.
People whose bodies would be characterised by others as fat. Yep.
About how to navigate that space, because I think there's also a really particular temporal question that we live through the obesity crisis, which is now, do you know what I mean? That is the nomenclature.
The loudest face.
No, this isn't me agreeing with it.
No,
do you know what I
no.
mean? This is about the way that I think medical guidelines continuously attune practitioners to have that lens.
Yes.
What lessons, I suppose, do you learn that you then now tell to others?
I've got a friend who's due to have her baby any day now, and my two biggest pieces of advice are advocate for yourself, or make sure that the person who's supporting you, if you have someone, because I recognise that that's not always the case, but your support person's job is to do what you can't do, or to supplement what you're doing. You're giving birth to a whole person, so they should do literally everything else. And that includes advocating for you in times where you feel vulnerable, yet also require support. Your medical caregivers are there. That's their job. And in most of their cases, while they might be looking at you through a lens of having a secondary thought about what they're going to need to do with you, the most important thing is that they want you to safely birth that person that you've cared for and grown inside you. So I think that advocacy, whether for yourself or through someone else, and to find a community that you resonate with. I think that the most important thing that I have found is being friends with other fat parents, because no one has that experience but you. Of course, motherhood and parenthood and caring for a child and loving them is a unique yet universal experience for most of us. But at the same time, that intersection of your two lives, of being a fat person but then also being a parent, when they come together, only other fat people can really understand what that looks like.
That's excellent advice. Do you know what I mean? The advocacy of self, of support, and then a broader community, I think really transcends just the issue of fatness and body relationship.
Truly.
Lefa, you are a writer and a creative producer. Your work centres on disability, feminism, and motherhood. Disability is a big term and also another big politic. And whatever the condition of body or mind that makes it more difficult for people with that condition to move through the world, undertake certain activities, interact with those around them, or systems to understand the reality of that person. Do you know what I mean? It's not just that person's challenges, but the challenges that the system really holds in not wanting to welcome reality. You write really beautifully about this, and I don't know if you have read this book, but We've Got This has an extraordinary diversity of stories around families and their experience of disability. It's very worth reading. We have it stocked up the back here with neighbourhood books. But your story really talks about how your pregnancy actually assisted in accepting and understanding and contextualising and really empowering you, I suppose, relative to your disability.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm going to jump in still, but there are still considerable barriers for parents with disability. Historically, disabled and chronically ill people, and particularly parents, have been restricted about choices often around their health and around their childbearing, and that discrimination really continues today. Sometimes it's explicit, sometimes it's insidious, but families Do you know what I mean? Not even just your clinical teams or others, but many people police disabled and the chronically ill's choices around parenting. Your experience actually delighted me and hardened me to read. I felt like I had so much to learn. But what else is it that we can do to try and challenge some of these rigid expectations that we have around what makes somebody a good parent?
Yeah, I think that's something that, and I'm so glad Eliza Hull pulled together such a diverse range of people to examine that question in the book. We've got this because within the disability community, there are obviously a vast difference of experiences, but something that you touched on is that fundamentally in the disability community, as in other communities, when we think about reproductive justice, a lot of the time in feminism, we think about it as the right to choose when you have your child, but predominantly through the lens of access to abortion. But in the disability community, reproductive justice often is the option to have children at all, for sterilisation of disabled people, and kind of restrictions or pressure to not have children at all is very common, and it's very difficult to push back against. It's structural as well as personal. And so just starting from that lens, starting from that really basic point of view, we know also that disabled parents are more likely to have their children removed, and those were some of the most touching and really heart-wrenching stories in We've Got This, particularly people with intellectual disability, that the structures are just not there to support them to raise children. And obviously we know in Australia that First Nations communities also are losing their children at enormous and terrifying rates. So I think one of the things that disabled people have to confront immediately is that birth is engaging with the health and medical system, and therefore in some ways automatically opens you up to more judgment, automatically opens you up to risk of losing your children, of not being able to get the assistance that you need to fall pregnant potentially, and certainly facing discrimination within that. But then also, once you have that child, those kinds of risks as well that may stop you from getting the kind of health care that you need. The maternal child health system, for example, being one of those that for a lot of white middle-class Australian women or people who've, got a newborn, is really designed to kind of help you and strengthen, okay, let's all look at the wellness of this baby, and part of that job too is to look at whether the birth person is supported and how they're recovering, but that can be really risky if you and your body and yourself are considered a risk to your child. So I think those are the kinds of things that are just so fraught and so big when you start thinking about disability justice and when you start thinking about disabled parenthood. And those stories in that book were really eye-opening. Even though I consider myself a part of that community, there were a lot of stories there that were really hard and difficult to read, and hearing some of the others talk, some of those authors talk about those experiences, just made me realise how silent that epidemic is, and the fact that it's not discussed and it's not talked about. And I hope the book is a really big first step towards some of those conversations becoming more explicit and becoming more public, I guess. And I think that's probably one of the biggest things that we can do, is actually just be honest about it.
And also I think you're describing the kind of illusory bubble that happens with pregnancy and pregnancy health care, that it isn't also a part of a lifelong trajectory of experiences with care or the absence of it, with your capacity to fit or not fit within a particular system, and also the legacy, I suppose, of generational traumas about how people, real people, have been treated by particular systems, even when those trying to take carriage of the system may be perfectly lovely, actually trying to circumvent those discriminations and stigmas. But the way that systemic work operates is often quite hard to address at the very individual level. So it's pregnancy doesn't just happen in this little bubble. These are all big things that happen across those systems.
Absolutely.
Frankie, I want to bring you into and also introduce you to the audience. You are a queer mother using love, and I love that word. I love love as a kind of force for social justice and change, but with love and compassion to explore pleasure, making art, and raise a babe. Writer, performance artist, sex worker and parent, you are devoted to spreading the gospel of pleasure through your work both on stage and off. In addition to your performance work, in its amalgamation of stripping, spoken word and showgirl grandeur, some of my favourite concepts. You have written for Archer magazine, Lip magazine and Bowen Street Press, and are currently working on a solo show for debut later this year. Sex work, queerness, and even really the economic volatility of an arts worker career are in some ways social and structural barriers to health and social services for pregnant and parenting people. No matter how structurally enduring that labour is, or how fundamental sex is to so many kinds of conception and parenting, how fundamental sex and sexuality and sensuality and pleasure and love are to being human, and hopefully to the eventual lives of the little humans that we seek to raise, our society loves to take the sexiness out of pregnancy and motherhood. And what is it? Do you mean like to strip it immediately, to desensualise the mother's body, the mothering body, but also the experience of interconnected, fleshy humanity that is so primal at the base of so many kinds of parenting relationships? What is it you think that we can do to embrace healthy conversation and experiences about sex and sexuality that normalise the vast uniqueness of human sexuality within pregnancy?
I think that the more that we can just talk about sex in general, the more that we can take the time to explore our own bodies, discover what our wants and desires are, to learn our own boundaries and to learn how to respect those boundaries and to how to respect other people's boundaries. The more that we can normalise conversations in general, the more that we can bring that conversation into sex within parenting and pregnancy. I think that we have a really narrow-minded view of what sex is in our culture, and that often means penis and vagina penetration. And it's really important for us to become aware that sex can mean so many different things to different people, and for someone it might mean penetration in that way, for someone it might mean penetration in a different way, or no penetration at all. And for someone else it might be kissing and touch, and for someone else it might not involve touch at all. And our sexuality is often viewed as who we are attracted to. And whilst that is one aspect of it, it can be who we are attracted to, like who and how we want to play with people. It is also our life force energy and our creative energy, and it can be stimulated and turned on in so many different ways. And the more that we are aware of how broad these terms are, sex and sexuality, the more that we can begin to comprehend how vast and unique the human experience is within all beings, and then including within parents and within pregnant bodies. And again, like you said, the virgin mother whore trope is still very much alive and kicking in our culture, and the more that we can dismantle that and dismantle our own internalized shame around that, the healthier the approach we can have towards sex and sex conversations around sex is. There's a magazine that's printed in Melbourne about sex, queerness and identity called Archer, and one of their captions is, "Sex is weird for everyone," and it is, and the more that we can just have those awkward conversations and come to the table and be brave enough to explore our own bodies and to have conversations with other people and communicate, the more that we're able to enjoy, bring back the pleasure in our sexual lives.
Lefa and April, I want to kind of interleave your experiences into this kind of central theme, because fat bodies and disabled bodies, bodies that work differently and bodies that are figured in different kinds of attractions, are also sometimes disallowed a right to be sexy. How have you, and it doesn't have to be about you as individuals, it could be as you as political agents, how have you sought to address or understand, both in yourself and others, where those interleaving identities, person living with a disability, person who is parenting, and also a sexual person?
Oh, okay. I shall dive in. I think what I was thinking as you were speaking then was around the idea of sexuality and the fact that for me, and you were talking about boundaries and pleasure, and for me, I think I had embarked on the idea of what my own pleasure looked like. 5 years later, I had a baby. and that was 5 years ago. And I'm like, oh, in those 10 years, I've really learned a lot about myself. First 26-ish years, I was kind of just hanging around being like, I don't know. But I think also understanding that not knowing which one of those things I wanted to unpack first. Is it how I feel about myself as a fat person? Is it how I feel about myself as a cis woman who wants to experience pleasure within a patriarchal society that tells you that you shouldn't, or if you do, don't tell anyone? But then also, if the idea of the P&V, the productivity of P&V is what essentially our society views sex as a gateway into pregnancy, into parenthood, into being the perfect mother, and kind of going, well, which one of those things do I want to not do or not buy into first, or as a primary thing? Because all of those things, the way that they come together is to kind of be like, okay, if you're fat, then you shouldn't feel sexy because you're not sexy. And then, but if you are feeling sexy and you want to have sex, then you should do it in a way that everybody feels comfortable with, which is in secret. And then when you tell people you're pregnant, you should definitely not talk about how you got there. And then after that, just kind of give us the baby and let us hold it. And so I think...
And we'll never think of you as sexy ever again.
And you will immediately be moved into that corner where nobody puts baby in the corner. Mothers, however, straight to the corner. And I think also, this horrid quote from someone who I won't name because they don't get to have their name said in this place, who said, watching my partner give birth was like watching my favourite pub burn down.
Oh gosh.
A, get out. And B, that is the message that we're exposed to. But the idea that some people would characterise having sex with a person who has a fat body as also like going to the pub that's already on fire. Yeah. Because like, why would you go there? And so it's all of these, the meetings of all of the ways, and obviously Lefa, you're going to be able to talk about your experience differently, but the idea that you're already only really okay if somebody else says that you are, by providing you with their presence, and kind of being that allowing you into a space where you become part of a group of people, which is sexy people, and knowing that actually that also looks different for other people based on, talking about gender, sexuality, all of those things. And I think, just that word disallowed. I think I've been disallowed from all of the spaces for all of the reasons: my skin colour, my body shape, my body size, my gender, all of the things. And yet I experience all of those things the same way as anybody else. So.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because, again, like where to get into that, because there's so much of it. But the thing that really strikes me is that the idea of, and not talking about pleasure and sexuality for mothers, for pregnant bodies, for all of those things, and the ways that we don't talk about disability, and it's almost like, well, all functions of the body, but particularly the female body, are distasteful, and pregnancy obviously falls within that. So exactly as you say, we want the baby, we want the end result, and maybe we're okay with a certain look and a certain shaped bump in a certain shaped body, but mostly just stay really quiet about how hard it might be, and don't bring those illusions down at all. And there's a lot of that behaviour around disabled bodies as well. Like, okay, well, we might tolerate you in certain spaces, but we don't want to hear the messy stuff. We don't want to hear how our structures actually make the messy stuff for you. And your body in itself should try as much as possible to conform to the closest version of a normative idea of a body. And so I think those things are just inextricable. Once you kind of put a disabled body and pregnancy together, you're kind of doubling down, and that is beyond uncomfortable for people. And one of the ways that happens for disabled people is just invasive questions, like you were talking about, don't tell us how you got pregnant. For disabled people, sometimes it's the exact opposite. It's, no, explain this to me. I need to know how possibly happen. Yeah,
how was it allowed?
I'm going to need some diagrams and all of this sort of stuff. So it's really interesting, I think, because of that idea of public bodies. If you don't have a normative body, then we have a right to know things about your body, to ask about your body, and to ask you to justify your body as well.
I think we have, in even just this very brief amount of time, touched across such an extraordinary amount of kind of experiences about how bodies move through space, how much and how little embodied knowing we have of our bodies. Do you mean how much you can know what your body will or won't do today when you look at a chronic illness or chronic pain? How much we are or are not allowed to learn or know what our bodies can do and what they experience as pleasure and delight. And also how much we implicitly surveil and police each other's experiences. Do you know what I mean? Sex is weird for everyone, but everybody also likes to think that no one else is allowed to have the weird sex.
Oh, yeah.
Do you know what I mean? We like to have an implicit kind of self-enforcing policing of other people's
It's
lives.
that real main character energy, is it not? To
It's-
be like, I am special, the rest of you, however. Yeah.
And I am going to kind of signal that I want to open it up to the community that's in the room here so that our ushers can start doing, and you can kind of gently gesticulate your hands so that they know where to go for it. But I guess one of the questions that I want to ask is, in this world full of a kind of narrow notion of who is allowed to become pregnant and how they're allowed to do it. You certainly can't be like, it was super raunchy, I was at a sex party with 4 people and then my chosen insemination partner decided to like go with it. That's not the normative trope. How is it we encourage people to enjoy pregnancy while also simultaneously recognising that there are places of I'm going to use this in a very social term, but quite disabling illness that are often experienced by people through pregnancy. There are many ways that my body newly failed me. I have new kinds of chronic illness and chronic pain as a result of pregnancy. It has fundamentally altered my sex life, whether through pelvic floor dysfunction and pain or other kinds of pain and recovery. How do we, with the kind of experience that we have here and the vastness of also the multiplicities of experience of other non-normative bodies, there's a lot of people in that sentence, but give women permission to enjoy pregnancy and acknowledge its challenges?
I'm so pleased that you raised this, because I think one of the things that when we talk about disability, people have kind of ideas of what that means. And one of the things that I think we don't talk about with pregnancy is how many people end up with birth injuries. So birth injuries are something that are hugely common and yet not often discussed. And certainly a lot of people are not prepared for the fact that their body will probably end up with birth injury. And this is something where, you know, the idea of identifying yourself as disabled is political, and I'm very proud to do it. A lot of people don't relate to that term, and frankly, I'm A-OK with that. I don't think you have to consider yourself disabled to be disabled, and I mean that as in to actively have a body that has been disabled by, in this case, we're talking about pregnancy. And I think that one of the things that I find empowering, and I hope other women can think about this too, is it's actually really strong to take the position to say, no, this happened to my body and it's been a shock, or maybe I did have some idea that this was going to happen, that my body would change in these really fundamental ways, and that's disabling, and it deserves attention. You know, it's one of the only big medical things that you go through where at the end you're not the only patient. So we were talking before about at the end you have this baby, and a lot of the healthcare that remains around pregnancy is all of this stuff around healthy baby, which for a lot of disabled people is a really triggering term.
No doubt.
But it is ultimately, you know, you get to the end and you've gone through this transformation however you birthed, and then everyone's like, great, now let's make sure this baby's okay. But so little of the conversation afterwards is, how is your body and what can we do for it and how will we make sure it's okay? And some of the choices you make around pregnancy can be framed as you being selfish if you care about how your body is going to experience these things. So we haven't even, I don't think, gotten to the idea of whether you can have pleasure in your body necessarily as a pregnant person, when we can't even admit that you may have a compromised body, or a body that is going through something that's very real and may have very long ranging consequences for you, some of which can be very disabling. And I think we have to be more honest about that, because if we can't even acknowledge that, how are we ever going to talk about pleasure in that body? And particularly when our idea of pleasure is quite a narrow idea of who can experience pleasure.
And in what permissible ways.
Exactly.
Frankie, would you like to add to that? Because I guess Lefa's describing that very binary world that we live in, where you're like, it's a good body or it's not a good body. It's a happy body or it's not a happy body. How do we find pleasure in a world of complex bodies?
Again, I think expanding what how we understand pleasure, and we have these really binary views of like pleasure looks like this, and if we start to kind of unpack that and understand that there is so much pleasure in our bodies that can be experienced in so many different ways, and if we expand our view of what sex can mean, which like I said, could be that really like normalized view of like P and V penetration, or it could, once we start to become more comfortable, like communicating within these spaces, something as simple as like touch on a back or touch on an arm or wherever it may be on the body, or not touch at all, like communicating through eye gazing or whatever that may be, we can start to expand our view of what pleasure can be, how we can experience pleasure, and then perhaps when we're working with bodies that, you know, aren't operating in the ways that we're used to, or we're working with injuries that are, you know, making us feel in different ways and making us relate to our sex and our sexuality and our bodies in different ways, we can find ways where we can still experience pleasure within those spaces.
April, do you want a last comment before I open to the audience?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I took away from what you've both just said is that everything that we do and we experience is held within this very narrow, you know, whether it's a system, whether it's a standard, whether it's an expectation. And the idea that if we could simply expand and not seek to invalidate what other people experience, I think when we talk about disability, and as you touched on, people won't necessarily self-ID as disabled whether they feel they're not disabled enough, because they'll be invalidated by a community of people, both in and outside of disability community, to say, well, but where's the line? There is no line. The whole point is we're all existing within our bodies, not within, well, we are within the systems, and you can't love yourself out of a system that doesn't want you on planet Earth. But the thing is, you can embrace the fact that while there's no limit to what it looks like to feel sexual and to have sex or to experience pleasure, that's not just in this box. Everything outside this box is something else. We haven't come up with a word for it. And the same with disability, I would think, and without wanting to speak over you. And I think also within you know, body image and what is known as body positivity, even though that's a whole nother chat. But I think that expectation of what it is to experience life, but especially as someone who's a birthing person, or as someone who wants to be able to understand their body better, relating to the experience of mother and parenthood, is that you are unlimited in what you might experience, and while there will be overlap with what you and other people experience, it is unique, and so there's no limit to what it is. And I think that's where we go wrong, is that the systems limit us, and we need to push those limits out.
Now, I am loving that I can hear embodied joy happening in the background. It feels very natural. I was like, people should just run around. Should just wear rainbow dresses. We should have a good life.
Go for it.
May I ask if there are any questions from the audience, or anyone who would like to even provide a comment or a sense of their own experience in this space? I feel a question here at the front.
Hi, thank you all so much for your comments and thoughts. It's been so thought-provoking and moving and interesting. I have a question for all three speakers, and I guess I'm wondering if you have any thoughts or experiences at this stage of your journey being parents about sex-positive parenting and parenting with an eye towards body acceptance. And by that I sort of mean parenting in a way that aims to, I guess, promote the celebration and acceptance of non-normative bodies, and parenting in a way that aims to promote a positive relationship to sort of pleasure and body in that way.
Oh boy, do I have feelings about this. Can we extend the panel for an hour just on this one question? I am such an obsessive advocate around educating kids about their own bodies and how that body engages in the world, and that comes from both my feminism and my disability politics. And really for me, parenting has just been, my eldest is 13, and it's just been such a journey, and the things that I thought I knew have been really challenged, and my own sex positivity has been really positive in terms of how that relationship has gone with me and my kids, and noting that one of them is 13, and so we're entering into a new era of that. And I feel really good about where we've been so far, but I do also think that it's really hard to be sex positive in this community system world, and I get to exist in a little bit of a bubble. You know, I've created a kind of extended family and world that I want for my kids, but also they go to a public school and they exist in the world, so, you know, welcome to the rest of it.
They probably have access to TikTok.
Again, this is a whole nother panel because I watch TikTok with my 13-year-old and we watch so much great queer content that is like so positive for them. So again, those things of the things that you think are going to be an enemy can sometimes turn out to be your best advocate, and the things that you think are going to help won't. But what I will say is just that I think that it's something we have to keep learning and keep struggling and keep dealing with, because the things that I thought were useful, 10 years ago compared to 5 years ago, compared to 2 years ago, compared to now, are changing all the time. And I think the most important thing is for us to just keep, I know it sounds like a cliche, but actually just to keep talking and having these conversations. And pleasure and consent are the two things that I think are the most important in those conversations with our kids. They understand it so much younger than people want to believe. And I have been talking with my kids about consent since they had no words for themselves. And I think we have to keep talking about those all the time. But I'm going to stop because I could just go forever.
I think following on from what you said with consent, I think it's really important for me to teach my child embodiment. I think that we can only really practice true consent when we are embodied beings, and whether that is, constantly checking in with their body and seeing how they feel, whether that is allowing space for all of their emotions and having compassion for all of their emotions, and not saying, generally not generally, but we exist in a culture that raises our kids with these are the acceptable emotions. You can be happy, you can be pleased, you can be enjoying yourself, and if you're sad or you're angry, then you need to go over there and sort that out by yourselves. And I think the more that we can create these safer spaces where children and people are able to express all of their emotions and to have those emotions met with compassion, the more that we can kind of sit with what's in our bodies and feel what's true for our bodies, and only from that place can we really practice consent. Then when we're moving into being teenagers and young adults, we can check in with ourselves from a really embodied space and know, what we're saying yes and what we're saying no to, and respect other people's boundaries from that space as well.
Yeah, and I think for me, what I've tried to do is, talking about boundaries and consent, is modelling what it looks like to get a response to your non-consent that is positive and healthy. Yeah. So to say to my child, would you like a hug? Or do you need a hug? And always making them the centre of what it is that they need, because I'm the person, I'm the safe place to land. Yeah. And so to be able for them to go, no thanks, and me go, okay, and that's it. Because then it gives you that understanding of what it is then if somebody responds unhealthily to your non-giving of consent or to your boundary, to be able to recognise that, this doesn't make me feel safe and comfortable, so this is probably not good for me. Yeah. And I think that, I would by no means characterise myself as a perfect parent any of the time, but I think to be able to, when especially talking about in the realms of sex positivity and how that ties in with consent more broadly, just the idea of I think being honest and using terms for body parts and things like that. My child said, did the doctor take me out of your tummy? No, you came out of my vagina. And he went, and I thought, well, now I've really set myself up. And he's like, where do babies come from? I said, well, it has to get in there to be able to get out. So I've kind of laid the groundwork for that conversation. So yeah, I think, and being able to be able to say, good and bad things about how you feel about yourself, and be accepting of feelings around your body and that kind of thing. And destigmatising, I think, is probably what I'm really going for, is to be able to have conversations where if my child says something, and you talk about going to school, he's started kindergarten, and so coming home and saying, using words that I don't accept, you can say the F word, as in the proper F word, but you can't say that someone's ugly or that they're stupid, because that's not okay. In context, you can, and not at school, say the F word. But I think for me, my idea is that you should. We've been taught about how politeness is more important than boundaries, and honesty. Yes, and how behaviour and how you're perceived is more important than how you feel. And I think that's my goal, is to send my child out when they're ready to go as someone who knows more about how they feel than I did when I started to branch out as a young adult. Or as a teen. And I think you're right that it is how we interact with things. Sometimes TikTok's a good example, when we choose to interact together with our child, and not, instead of being like, I'm either policing you or ignoring you, but instead we're going to do this together. I think that's really useful.
this is just a small addition, because I feel that this is all deeply, deeply worthy conversation, and it could, in fact, really be a panel unto its own right. But a really kind midwife said to me once that, you know, that my kids would learn so much from what I did more than what I said. So I didn't have to worry about being on scripted all the time, but that it wasn't worthless to take care of myself or to know what it is that felt right for me, and that healing myself or feeling my own pleasure, being able to set and establish healthy boundaries, those are all things that I can show my kids in the way that I move through the world without having to have necessarily always, in every case, put myself through a module on something that prescribes how I respond to my kids. So I think that you can do it every day in really, really gentle and subtle ways that have lifelong meaning and resonance for kids and small people.
Absolutely.
Anyway.
Agreed.
I think we have a time for maybe one, possibly another question, if anyone does have one that they'd like to ask.
I actually have a question, Eleanor. Over here.
And then there's one more question, so
And
we'll
then
fit
there's
two.
one more. Thank you, our beautiful panel. I just wanted to
This
kind
is Jamila, one of our curators.
and as soon as you started talking, Lefa, about being so passionate about the conversation around consent and bodies, and my daughter's only 2, and already we're having this kind of experience where she loves being, you know, without her clothes, and she's so free, and she's going to nursery, and she's really starting to be aware of her body parts. And I just wanted to know, at that young age, what the sort of conversation you can have that keeps that sense of freedom for her, but also allows her to know that there are boundaries. Like, I think that, you know, idea, April, of asking if someone wants a hug or needs to be picked up is something that we try and do as well. But yeah, if there's anything that, for that younger age, where you can encourage that compromise of boundary and freedom.
Yeah, for sure. So I think what's interesting is that at that age, you know, yeah, I've had one of those kids who's just like whip it all off all the time, yeah, naked. And so I think one of the things that we have to think about is the way that our kids understand difference all the time. So with a 2-year-old, you can talk about places that it's okay to do certain things, and they know that. So there are certain things that my kids will instinctively do at their grandparents that they don't do at my house, because they know their grandparents are a soft touch. And so they will, you know, behave a certain way, and they get away with that. And then they look at me like, do you see me doing this? And I'm like, it won't last. I'm going to take you home, you know. So even with that, like, it doesn't mean there are no boundaries anywhere ever. And I think that's something that some people do get a bit caught up on, like, oh no, where is that? You can say, this is awesome. I love that you love your body. You know, it's great to do this at home. It's great to do this here, but it's probably not that great elsewhere. And if they have follow-up questions about that, why is it not okay to do that? Then you can go through those conversations at different age-appropriate levels. But I think the most important thing, and what we're all trying all the time to do, is actually to give them agency over their own body. Yeah. And that's about their own safety for the rest of their lives. They should feel like they have agency over their body, and they should also feel like they do not have agency over other people's bodies.
Right.
And so at all times, and particularly for me when I was raising male-identified children, it's been so important and a really big challenge for me to think about all the ways that they're taught along the way that it's fine to behave certain ways, to roughhouse or, you know, to tickle or to do all of those things. And sometimes it was exactly that. Oftentimes we're teaching them with not what we're saying necessarily, but what we're doing. So yes, that idea that if you say stop, I stop, doesn't just teach them I have body agency, it actually also teaches them other people do too, because you're expected to behave that way with other people. So I think that at its most basic level is just the stuff that we are doing all the time that maybe we don't think about in those contexts of being about consent, but it all adds up to that.
Yeah, I think, and that's I guess the flip side of consent is, do you also have that consent? And even as a child, understanding that someone wanting to ask you, do you want a hug, or the flip side of that is that person doesn't want to potentially, you know, experience you in your naked freedom. And also knowing then as we get older too that, and this is sort of a separate thing but related, the idea of nudity isn't the only way to express yourself, to be free, to express sexuality and desire and arousal. You know, there's no reason for you, again, we're ascribing these particular behaviours and things to what it is to be free, to be liberated. Yeah. You can be covered from like completely covered and still feel free in context.
Absolutely. And you can be naked and it's not sexual as well.
True. All of that is correct.
All of the above. May I welcome our questioner just here at the front?
Thanks so much. It's been a great panel discussion. I just wanted to say, I think a lot of people would think that the maternity care system needs reform, and I'm a midwife, and often the conversations go to around removing birth from the hospital or the medicalised space. But for some people, that's not possible to be extricated from the medical system. So I guess I'm just wondering, how can we make the hospital or the medicalised space of birth more friendly to different bodies? I think it's very focused on one type of body, and this concept of risk and high risk or low risk really infiltrates the kind of language that we use with women in pregnancy. So I'm interested to hear all of your perspectives on how we can make that space kinder and more nurturing.
I would expect probably one of the first things that would create the most change would be to see people who've lived the same experience as me as a caregiver rather than, for me, the idea of having a fat brown midwife would give me comfort, especially, in the sense that for most of us, we see ourselves reflected in our surroundings, or for some of us, we never see ourselves reflected in our surroundings. I think there's a huge amount of privilege in wanting to remove birth from the medical system, knowing that how medical birth can be and how much, we expect people who are elite athletes or people who undertake other types of activities to rest, recover, train, be injured, all of the things, but birthing you're supposed to do and go back to cleaning the kitchen or whatever. But I think that, the idea that we would perhaps see students in medical fields being people who have these intersectional identities that we share is one of many contributing factors. When you, like I did, give birth in a regional hospital, regional-ish hospital, where all of the caregivers were people who I could not resonate with their life experience, I very much felt like I was a subject rather than experiencing that as a collective. And I think collectivity is really one of the key things around birthing that we lose a lot of, but sometimes we have to forego that to be able to give birth safely as well.
Yes, I agree with everything that you said, and I had quite a positive experience through the public system, birthing through the public system, and I feel like what was really helpful for me was self-educating myself prior to birthing of, these are the kinds of ways that I can advocate for myself within the system. I also had what's, thankfully not a term anymore, a geriatric womb, and, was really pushed towards having an induction and having, if the birth didn't come right on time, like these are the steps that we're going to take. And it was only that I was able to have access to other forms of education that I could, know what was healthy and what was dangerous for my body and how to advocate myself within that public system. And I don't think that, that access for me came at a cost. I went and bought classes outside of, the public system and was able to learn in that way things that we never learn in school. I think a lot of, a lot of these things should be taught and should be learnt by all bodies, whether they have wombs or not, within public school systems, and then we'd all feel like we had more of an understanding of what the birthing process is. But yes, I found my own access to that prior to giving birth, and like I said, that came as an expense to me, and I feel like that kind of access should be free and should be like part of a universal healthcare system that everyone should be able to have access to, so that we can have a real understanding of, what the physiological experience of birthing is and what that's going to look like, and have more access to the birthing through there's these midwife programs that you can birth through, which I found really great, but they're very limited. If you don't get in pretty much on the day of conception, you're probably going to miss out. And I wasn't nearly ready to even think about, as someone who'd had a miscarriage prior, I didn't even look at how I was going to birth until many months into my journey of pregnancy. So I think having more access to those midwife programs, having more access to education, having more free education around birthing, and also, fourth trimester, breastfeeding for me was really difficult as well, and nobody talked about that. I was like, wow, I thought I'd gotten through the difficult bit and this was going to be easy. So I think just having more access to education, having more free education, having more midwives within the system.
And to follow on directly from that, for people who do set about educating themselves and who feel empowered, which was what I was like, by having as much information as possible, that those people are not treated like there's a bit of eye rolling that can happen within the medical field about if you're opinionated about how you want to give birth, and there's a lot of assumption that you're naive if you think you can have a natural birth. There's a lot of undermining that happens along the way, and I say that as someone who never had any anticipation that I could have a natural birth. I have ME/CFS, I don't have any energy to start with, and yet when I tried to find, I was within the private system, when I was trying to find someone who would work with me to figure out what birth would look like and what kind of support I would need, my first obstetrician I was trying to explain to her what I live with, what my daily life is like. And she just looked really confused and looked at me and said, well, put it this way, if you can vacuum the house, you can give birth. You know, it's good to have that reaction from a room full of people because, exactly, I would say that most people who had gone through birth would have a pretty strong reaction to that statement. I had not gone through birth yet, and yet I had a pretty strong reaction, which was, what planet are you on? And so, you know, those are the kinds of things that, as someone who, I was made to feel like I was being a bit difficult by really asking any questions or having any extra needs or extra issues to be dealt with. And that's a very common story. If you start listening to people who have, you know, gone through those experiences, particularly for people who want to avoid certain medical interventions, there is this kind of, well, you're a bit naive to think that you can have any control over your birth, any say over it. We're the experts here. And I think just that acceptance and that growth, I hope, that's happening from when I had my first in 2010, even now to the stories that I hear now, there does seem to be some movement on that front. But I don't think it's necessarily that we all have to leave hospitals. I think it's that we have to change the way that the hospital behaves towards pregnant people. We're the experts on our own bodies, and that's something that the disabled community fights really hard about and probably can lend a lot of, you know, kind of strength to those arguments. We're the experts on our body. We know ourselves and know we may not have gone through birth before, but that doesn't mean that we don't know things that will be helpful in that context or that should be taken into account in that context. And all people who are going into birth know their body better than anyone else.
That sounds like a really wonderful note to end on, although not a note necessarily that really draws us to a conclusion, because I feel like I actually have so many more questions. I do have a list of more questions that I want to ask about this, but I feel that in this expansive understanding of bodies, of the systems that engage with those bodies, about the pros, the cons, the difficulties that can come from being a person who conceives, carries a pregnancy and then looks to parent, I feel that we've all had a real opportunity, I guess, to reflect on some of the flat and narrow depictions of what is acceptable and good and valid, and what those impacts are from those limited depictions. So I hope that you would join me now in putting your hands together to thank our three panellists, the Bodzilla, April Hélène-Horton, Frankie Van Can here in the centre, Lefa Singleton Norton, and thank them for their generosity and time today. I just want to flag that there is one more panel session after this, or a screen session, which is talking about on-screen depictions and the real-life implications of motherhood in Australia's film and television industry, with a panel of actors, writers and directors, and I believe they will be back in this room in 15 minutes? In an hour, that's so great. 4 o'clock gives you time to rest and recover. Is there a panel in between this or a soapbox? There is free time, guys. Seek pleasure. Thank you very much. Join us once again in thanking our panel and
thank
farewell.
you, Eleanor.
Thanks, Eleanor.
Oh,
Thank you.
pleasure. Just realised I was like, oh, I don't have clear out.
I'm threadbare and bursting slowly at the seams, and all those dreams like jumping castles are slowly deflating.